Hello guys and welcome to episode 5 of Source Talks, the Tech Lab. My name is Gus Firth and I'm a managing consultant here at Source Technology. Today I'm joined by Gab Michels. Gab has been in the industry about 15 years. He started his adventures at RTL. He then moved on to ride the wave of browser games at BigPoint and GameSys, and he even had a shot at building his own startup. Today, he's on the journey to transition the food industry to more sustainable food systems at a company called Choco in Berlin. He's been with the company since its conception when he joined as a software engineer, and today he is the director of engineering. I'm really excited for this discussion. Gab himself is going to be an amazing guest, and yeah, can't wait to delve into it. Today we're going to be talking on the topic of communication, how to really maximize it, how to use it in business context, personal context, and how to be effective using it in interviews, hiring with stakeholders, non-technical stakeholders, decision makers, and really learning more just about Gab's journey and how he implements communication into his daily life and the values he holds around it. So really excited to get into this discussion. Without further ado, let us begin. Good afternoon, Gab. How are we doing today?
Hello, Gus. Thank you for the invites. Doing all well in good old Berlin, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Amazing. Great to hear. I always ask the same question at the start. It'd be great to sort of jump into your story so far. So can you tell us a little bit about your sort of journey into the tech industry, from where software really captured your heart to where we are now?
Yes. So we have to go back like around nearly 20 years, 19 years. So like there's this concept called an apprenticeship in Germany, right? So basically, instead of studying, you have the option to do this apprenticeship where you go to work, you join a company, but like also you are committed to go to school. And then at the end of the usually 3 years, you get a certificate that you can basically do this kind of job. And back then it was more focused around media design. I was always like on the creative side of things, and beginning of the 2000s, it was like everyone wanted to do something with media, right? So then in that company, RTL, as you mentioned, which was more focused on media design, actually I did different kinds of departments. So I ran through engineering, I did a bit of journalism. So for those who don't know, RTL is like a TV broadcaster, big TV broadcaster in Germany. And at the end of the 3 years, I had the option to stick around as a Flash developer. Now, for those who don't remember, Flash is a dead technology, like that's basically dropped off the radar a couple of years back, but it was actually a pretty big thing. So for years and years, and actually the majority of my career, I've done ActionScript and Flash, especially because it's been used for like browser games and like ads and microsites in the early days. So that went on for like, I don't know, like let's say 2015 maybe. And then at that point, it really started dying. And like we transitioned and HTML5 and all these kind of technologies were picking up. So we decided to move on into other technologies. And that's when I went more into the React space, etc. So from then onwards, I then started actually my own startup. So I'd been through a couple of companies doing Flash. At some point, I decided, okay, let's do my own startup. A friend dragged me into it and saying like, hey, I need some technical advice. And I thought I was just giving advice until like a couple of months in, suddenly you realize that you're like one step through the door. And then I had to make a decision. Do I pursue this? And I thought like, you know what, let's see where this leads us. And that brought me eventually then to Berlin. And I mean, it was not successful. It was like a 6-month adventure, full-time adventure. I did it like 6 months on the side of my previous job. And I learned tons during that phase. How to run a business, what is important. The startup was called Zoe, and it was more focused like on a tool to build relationships inside of bigger companies. But eventually we failed because of classic startup mistakes. We went full time with no clients. We were living off of our savings, and so we ran out of money eventually. But the advisor of our startup back then was Daniel Kashap, who's my CEO now. So the day I decided to not pursue my own startup, I had dinner with him by coincidence, really, and he said like, "Oh man, it's sad that you're not continuing, but how about you join my company that I'm about to launch?" And that's how I made my way to Choco eventually as a software engineer.
Amazing. That's such a cool, like the way things interlink and everything. And then what was it sort of about Choco that made you want to join? Was it obviously Daniel himself and that influence? What else kind of draw you to the company?
I think the previously in my previous companies, I never had such a strong focus on mission, right, and the problem space in particular. And Daniel, he spent like a year digging into the problems of the food supply chain, right? So our goal at Choco is to eventually enable a sustainable food system, right? Now, why is this important, right? So, I think 24% of all greenhouse gases is actually coming uh, from the from food itself, right? And inside of the food supply chain, 40% of food is wasted, right? And inside of that 40%, 75% is actually directly in the supply chain. So before it even gets to the table, right? So there's no accountability, no transparency in the food industry. And so what we are trying to do, like where Choco comes into play, is that we want to bring the visibility and digitize all the value adding players inside of the supply chain to operate more efficiently, right? Gain more profits, be able to track and reduce their food waste, so that overall we can reduce food waste, greenhouse emissions, etc. Right? And I've never had such company that had such an important mission, and I think that's what drew me and still keeps me here today, because like I always say to myself, like, if we don't do it, who else will, right? And that's why I'm here.
Nice. So really, truly like a tech for good company, and you've obviously been there since the inception. I mean, just a comment by myself as well. Since having worked with Choco directly, it's such an easy sell for engineers, and it's really great the things that you guys are doing. Obviously, that space at the moment, the food tech industry, there's loads of Berlin startups, massive Berlin tech companies as well, sort of like your Delivery Hero, the gorillas of the world as well, these sort of businesses. There's a lot of pressure from loads of stakeholders in the market. Obviously, what's some of the biggest challenges you're facing right now, Gav?
So one thing maybe to clarify now that you mentioned as well, where do we stand actually in the food tech space, right? So we obviously have all those quick commerce players like Flink, or previously like people knew Gorillas or Getir. You have the food deliveries like Deliveroo and Just Eat, right? Um, but we are really focused on basically the back of the house of restaurants, right? So right now, what we're doing is focusing our efforts on the end of the supply chains. On the one side is the producer, on the other side are restaurants and their suppliers, right? And so with restaurants and their suppliers, we want to enable them with our tools, with our applications, to run their businesses and order operations more efficiently, and get to the goal of like reducing food waste, right? And so in terms of challenges in this space, I think many players try to get into this space as well, but the biggest challenge is actually beating pen and paper. It's such an analog, old school industry where people call their vendors, ask for their offers, where they actually write down what they want to order, speak on the answering machine. Here in Germany, like even there are quite some restaurants who use fax, right? Can you believe it? So it's actually quite a challenge to shift those habits, right? And so this is what we're facing on a day-to-day, to like get them to see the value and bring things that are different for them, that they are not used to previously, pre-Choco, basically.
Obviously, some amazing description there of what you guys are doing. What are some of the sort of key values that you've really learned from growing up from a software engineer all the way through management?
In which dimension do you mean values?
So values, just sort of the values that both Choco reflect and also that you've picked up in regards to whether it be team building, whether it be, you know, building these supplier relationships with or producer relationships.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start off with the company values that have carried us for a long time. So one day we were sitting in our small space in Katzorange in Berlin Mitte, because the owner of Katzorange was one of our angel investors and provided us with some space, office space. And so one day we were sitting there and saying, like, laying out some fundamentals and saying, like, we need to look at team, we have to take care of, like, we need to really take ownership, we have to focus and be very dedicated, and we need to bring understanding for our users, for everything, for the space, for what we're doing. And so then we realized, okay, team, ownership, focus, understanding, TOFU, tofu. So it was a very catchy term that we could really pick up and internalize over years and years to come, right? So this is still here. And one thing that I want to really narrow down into is the team aspect. And now, you know, many will be saying, oh yeah, obviously team. But I think that is something I want to remind people as well, right? That team, the people, the relationships that you build are so important to build a successful company as well, right? Like I always, one of my takeaways is like the first 10 people inside of your organization will carry the culture forward, right? And you really need to define what kind of culture do you want to build. And especially over the past 5 years where we've been quite hit by COVID, and the operating models of companies have been shifted, it's been very much going towards remote work. But I do think that like the aspect that you're losing are the relationships that you build with your colleagues, or like friendships that you build, and like actually effectively communicating and sitting here on a day-to-day basis next to each other and just being able to turn around and run ideas through each other. These are quite underestimated things. And I think when you build a business and you have like a large goal to achieve, this is truly something that you need, and you need people that are on board with this, because the problems that you're trying to solve will not solve themselves, right?
I love the idea of the concept of the first 10 people or the first dozen people really carry the culture forward. Since I mean, technically, you know, you've become, you've had a great Series A and Series B, and then a Series B2, I think it is as well. And like, it's really some amazing funding and become a unicorn business. And that sort of hyper growth, the term that we like to throw around a lot these days. What's sort of been the biggest challenge to carrying on that culture? Has it been the remoteness aspect, or has it been something else, you think?
I think, you know, where to start in those 5 years. I think like in those 5 years, there certainly have been better times to like launch companies, right? So we went from 2018, then into COVID in 2020 and living through that, and now having an economic downturn, right? And I think that's for us being heavily building on our relationships and bonding people. Like we have offices across the world, and like pre-COVID, we would really make an effort to bring people together so that you have a face to the name, right? And so making up for that is quite difficult. And I do think that at the beginning of COVID, that we actually lived off of what we built up in the first kind of 2 years, right? So we had those cultural ambassadors keeping things together. And then, when you want to go back in old operating modes, or like bring people together, that was just like near impossible, right? And you need to be very creative in some matters. And I think also just the ambiguity that like all of this brought, like how are we going to move forward? Are we going to be remote at some point, or what kind of people do we bring in? Do we hire remotely across the world? I think there was just a lot of ambiguity, and I think that's part of building a startup. But I think those were just external factors that really added a different layer on top.
Yeah, obviously a big challenge as well. And you guys have always been quite good at beating that sort of, standard market norm. When you talked about beating the pen and paper aspect, or this remote first aspect. Yeah, it's always about finding a way forward. Leading on into the core bit of our discussion, which I'm super excited about. Today we will be discussing communication. Obviously, a very broad term. Everyone can communicate. Everyone knows what it is. But why in this context, Gabriel, are we talking about communication? Like, what does communication mean to you?
So I think over the years that I've grown here at Choco, I've grown to realize and identify nuances in communication. And I've seen different kinds of communication breakdowns. And many people say, like, oh, yeah, communication needs to improve either on organization level, on an individual level. And I think it's important to myself to actually bring some focus into this space, because I think it's a very underrated skill to focus on, right, as an individual. And so I think today we're just going to unpack some of the examples, talk about why this is important in the first place, and how you can improve.
And just sort of some of those contexts as well. Like, why is it important, sort of in your context as a leader? What makes communication so important at the forefront of this?
So I think first of all, we need to take a step back, right? So if we think like, what are the different dimensions of communication? Obviously, you have the verbal communication, you have nonverbal communication, you have written communication, and you have also like visual communication, right? And then you have in the end, like when we take another step back, right, and we talk about what is communication in the first place. So these were the kind of different dimensions that we listed. But what is communication? Communication is information management, right? It's transporting information, and this can be done in different ways. And I think that we, especially the more senior you get, the more important it is to work on your communication skills, because what communication is as well is influence, right? So in the end, when you actually enable yourself and work on yourself to improve your communication skills, you will also be more effective as a leader, right? The more senior you get, the more obviously the more you become a leader, and more leadership skills you need to acquire, even as an individual contributor. And what for some ICs works until they're like on a senior level, if you want to progress, you will need to be working on yourself and your communication skills. So that's why it is important in the engineering space, I think, in particular, to be mindful about like how to go on about communication and what is it that I need to work on myself when I speak about communication and I'm not so good in communication. What does that actually mean, right? For myself.
Yeah, great. I mean, great answer, and we'll definitely be breaking that down on the topic of being more senior and growing in communication and that as a skill set. You've obviously recently been to the Lead Dev conference in London, where you're talking about sort of handling your own emotions as a leader, managing a team, and that sort of emotional intelligence. I guess you could phrase it like that. In regards to communication, let's start with this. Like, how did you prepare for such a big keynote speech like that, where you're talking to a crowd and in front of 1,000 or so people?
Yeah, so great question. I think there is this person that I follow on social media. His name is Vin Giang. He's actually like a communication specialist. His handle on Instagram is Ask Vin, and he has some great techniques on how to improve communication. And like, he also emphasizes that communication is influence, and many people come to him because of public speaking as a whole. But in the end of the day, the things that you learn when you prepare for a presentation are things that you actually need to apply on a day-to-day basis as well. So one reel that I have in my mind that I was looking in terms of preparation for lead dev was, he was saying like, okay, how long do I prepare for a presentation, right? And he was saying like, can't remember the exact hours, but you need to spend X amount of hours just preparing the content of the presentation, but then the number of hours spent in preparing the delivery of the presentation was like 10x, right? So it was a lot of time going into the preparation of the presentation, and I would use his methodologies and be really mindful about the techniques to use to really get the crowd engaged and listen to you, right? And when I speak of his techniques, and these are just not his techniques but general ones, are you need to pay attention to the volume that you're using when you speak to a person. I'm even doing this right now, right? So I vary my volume, I vary the rate of speech, I use pauses, the pitch of your voice. These all need to be varied if you want to be effective in delivering a presentation itself. And so before that, I really spent tons of time, just like it was a 10-minute presentation, right? So I would go through it like hundreds of times to then really have it inside of my head, and I could just blindly give the presentation. I would stand in the shower and give the presentation to myself, basically. So this is how I eventually prepared for the presentation.
Yeah, it's obviously so important. I remember, I'm trying to relate this to recruitment. I remember my first ever interview for recruitment. We had to do like a pitch on what market you would do, why, what kind of effectiveness you would have. And I was a bartender before, I didn't have anything to know about sales. But it's so, and I remember practicing the pitch in the shower, right? And just I had the pitch there. It took 10 minutes to write, and then 2 hours I was just practicing this day and night, and it was terrible. It was absolutely abysmal. And now those sort of points that you make in terms of pauses and fluctuating your voice or the different tones, and it is so important, especially in something like sales, or something like in marketing, like company like Choco, or pre-sales, all these things where if you pause even for 3 seconds, you're going to get so much more out of that other person, and it's little things like that. Vin, I think Vin Guang, you said, what was the most helpful tip that he had that you applied to your speech?
I think and this is also coming from Dan, our CEO. He's also an amazing public speaker, and I would usually start it off small, like, yeah, welcome, here we are, I'm going to speak today. But he said the first thing that comes out of your mouth needs to capture the crowd, right? So be bold with how you start and like go right into it, because this is the moment to capture the crowd. So and now I go back to Vin, and he said, like, start with a story, right? Like the words before we start are so powerful, right? And so this is where you can bring a story to relate to the content that you're about to present, to then lead up and set the tone for the rest of the presentation.
And you did that quite perfectly, right? You started off with a story about an engineer, and then you stopped halfway, and then at the end of the speech, you brought it all back and sort of brought it all together. Yeah, I would definitely recommend going to look at the speech. We can leave it in the comments. I don't know if you have access to it still, but we can figure that out, hopefully.
Yeah, it's actually behind a paywall. So like, if you want to see the presentation, it was from Lead Dev London 2023. And you can, if you want to watch it, you can get access to it. I don't know the details of Lead Dev, but that's where you can find it, basically.
Fantastic. And when we're talking about, let's first of all start maybe not with sort of technical stakeholders, but more like non-technical stakeholders and these sort of technical concepts that you're trying to articulate to them, ensure the team alignment for projects and everyone's on the sort of same page. How do you even go about articulating some of these concepts?
Yeah, so I think for many engineering managers or directors or technical stakeholders, they usually just use the terms blindly that people are used to throw around in engineering itself, right? So one thing to keep in mind of when you speak to non-technical stakeholders is what's like how do we get on the same page of what we want? Usually you have a request, maybe tech debt or something like that, technical initiative, and you want to clarify its importance. Or maybe there's something that broke down and you need to explain the problem and why it's harder to solve. You need to translate it in a way that non-technical stakeholders understand. So the way I usually go on about this is either use examples of the past that resonate quite closely. So remember that time when we had to do this. This is a similar case where we need to focus on this. Otherwise, it will lead to X. And this is the important bit as well that people and non-technical stakeholders will understand is the business impact that it will have, right? And so you always need to speak in these terms, right? They don't care about the technical implementation and the details about it, but like, what impact will it have? What's how much will it cost the business? And yeah, and the same along those lines, like how much time is spent on it, right? And a good way also to go on about this that I use personally is like, if it's really hard to get through, like to use metaphors as well, right? Of things that apply in day-to-day situations to that kind of resonate as well, right? But that's already more advanced, I feel like, using metaphors.
For sure, and it's sort of similar to what you said about sort of painting a picture or even creating a story using the metaphors or even an example of the past, maybe definitely focusing on the business impact. That's super important. What about on the other side of things, right? So when we're talking about your development teams, your QA teams, these product management teams that do appreciate the quality of the migration project or the implementation project, they do understand the technical details. How do you kind of keep this clear and concise when you're communicating and like promoting collaboration between those different teams?
I think one thing that you see with development teams or like squads, pods, however you want to call it, is oftentimes communication breaks down or problems arise when either they don't use the common language, or they don't have a framework, or no sort of agreement within the team, right? So I think it's important to clarify the language that you use so everyone understands what we are doing here and there's no ambiguity. And obviously also finding the common goals, right? So what do we both want to achieve? Like, what do we want to get out of this, right? So let's say we're planning an initiative. What is the goal behind this? Or even if it's like a smaller task, right? Or just sitting down in a meeting, what is the goal of the meeting, right? So you want to really reduce wasted time. So you need to be very clear, use common language that everyone understands so that there's no ambiguity and no back and forth. That's usually where then things get tricky, right? Like, hey, wait a second, we forgot about that. Okay, if this is a pattern, then like maybe we should really pay attention to this and like create a template that incorporates all these different details and questions so that we get better and faster in the way we execute, right? So this goes then more into the written communication, right? So these kind of things are things that to pay attention to.
Yeah, and it also goes back to sort of what you said about the initial answer, getting on the same page, regardless of who you're speaking to, get on the same page, you know, and have that clarity of the sort of the language that you are using. So that's great. What about, like you just mentioned, for example, when you can see these communication gaps maybe within a team, maybe the product management's on a completely different page to some of the developers or something like this sort of software development process, how do you identify and address these gaps sort of early on to maintain that efficiency and that sort of momentum you're talking about?
Yeah, so I already mentioned like communication breakdowns, right? And I think first and foremost, it's important to identify like what exactly broke down, right? And just to name a few, there are multiple things here. Like it can be knowledge silos, right? So maybe a team is working on something, and the neighbor, like another team, is also working on the same thing, right? So somewhere, information has not been distributed correctly, or the right people not being involved or informed, right? So this goes then, if you spin this further, some knowledge silos, where might it be coming from? So maybe you picked the wrong communication channel, right? So maybe you sent a Slack message on a Friday evening or whatsoever, I hope not, and people don't read it, right? If you don't want people to read something immediately, like Slack is a very synchronous kind of tool, if you ask me. Like people, it depends on like how companies use it, but like things fly by fairly quickly. If you don't want people to respond immediately, then you might as well send an email, for instance, right? Or tag them on a Notion page, Google Doc, whatsoever, right? But there are other communication breakdowns as well. Like people might have used the wrong tone or wrong language, right? This is quite often the case when we talk about pull requests and engineering. People get offended, these kind of things, right? Or just simply the time spent. When you think about async, synchronous communication, how often have I seen threads of like 40 replies going back and forth? No, I think it's here, or maybe it's there, or I think this person knows more, right? Just grab the people 5 minutes into a call, or the benefits of being in the office, just grabbing them here, walking over, and sort it out. And like usually this fixes it quite fast. So it depends on what you where the issue lies. So most importantly, identify that there is an issue. If it's a one-off, fine, right? But if you see patterns, then maybe it's time to rethink your approach and address it within the team. Create a communications framework. When do we use which channels, for instance? Create templates to be clear on like acceptance criteria, for instance, right? So there are many ways to be clearer, and I'm not saying that like process is always the right thing to go by, but depending on what breaks down, first and foremost, identify the problem, seek the patterns, and see in what ways can we get through this to not waste any time and reduce the ambiguity.
Yeah, great answer. I love that. When do we use different channels? It's such an easy concept, but like it's so hard in principle, right? Some people love email, some people love Slack, some people just love picking up the phone and getting on with it. And it's about identifying, like you said, spotting those patterns. What broke down here? Why is it taking so long to do a pull request or something similar, or do a certain ticket?
Yeah, and also like it goes the other way around as well. Like not only in terms of problems, but sometimes when you want to show gratitude, right, and bring visibilities to people of your team, then you have to also be mindful where you do it. You can do it either in your team channel and no one else knows about something that they've done great, or you can do it in maybe the wider engineering channel, domain channel, whatsoever, right, to do these kind of things, or in your email, tagging the right people and bringing the visibility. I think like these are also the things in the other direction that you can be mindful on how to use communication to also like build even more trust within your organization.
Yeah, people always say like it's so important to understand how people work and how people learn, but on the flip side, it's so simple to overlook how people communicate, right, and understand which works best. Out of interest, how do you like sort of celebrate success at Choco? Let's say something amazing happened for a certain individual, for example. You want to share that with the group. What's the best way of celebrating success, do you think?
So I think usually like there are multiple channels. I think the first and foremost one is inside of our EPD is what we call our tech. EPD stands for engineering, product, and design. So we have a channel, and then people highlight each other and give a shout out. We can do that also through our internal system. There's like a kudos board where you can just give a shout out and everyone gets notified. But we also like to do these kind of things as well when we have all hands, like we spoke a bit about tofu. We have like these kind of tofu awards where we can nominate people who have done exceptionally well over the last couple of weeks and months, right? So I think that's the place, and like it's good that people can nominate each other and acknowledge each other as well.
Yeah, I love that. And just going back to tofu, in case anyone forgot, it's team, ownership, focus, and understanding, right?
Exactly.
So we've gone on sort of over the effective ways of using the verbal communication and discussed a couple of strategies that how you implement it. You did talk about this sort of documentation and knowledge sharing, obviously as very essential in terms of knowledge sharing. Documentation is very important. How do you ensure that this the verbal communications complement the written documentation?
Sometimes it's also the other way around, right? So I think especially when you write documentation and write documents in general, sometimes people don't really spend the time needed to read the things that they're supposed to. So you might as well double down on this and then use a different communication channel, right? Like either in the next team meeting to highlight it as well, right? And showcase like, hey, folks, this is it. Just a quick outline of what this document entails. I need your feedback till Friday, right? So I think like over communicating is generally something that can help, right? I think it also very much depends on your communication culture in the organization, so it can be very different. But I think there are many ways to promote and share knowledge within the organization. So some things that we do here, for instance, when there's a theme or a topic, we have so-called like, for us, it's called lunch and learns, right? So it's classic brown bag sessions, and people have always something to present and to showcase, especially when it goes more in the functional direction, maybe design, or maybe explain something interesting, what we found in user research or something like that, right? So this is a nice space where we provide lunch. People can sit down, ask questions, and gain insight into a different topic. I think there are other tools that you can use to share knowledge, which is, I think, also very underrated, is like pair programming and pairing, right, on a task. It reduces the, if you sit down and do a task together, then you already have the task basically reviewed, right? And you've shared the knowledge. You don't need to pass on the knowledge and need to explain this, right? And then obviously you can do dedicated sessions, for instance, when we have like a tech specification, we call them tech design docs here, and it gets a bit more complex. You might as well do a dedicated session for people to have the headspace pre-reads, and then actually also get into the discussion of like how we can move these things forward and share the knowledge, right? And I think a lot of it is also, though, dependent on the people that you bring into the organization, right? So communication oftentimes is attached to a different trait. And so I think, more proactive people will also bring in this behavior of sharing knowledge, right? So it's not only purely communication, but like what else the person displays.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it's really cool to seeing how you sort of encourage and support that culture of knowledge sharing. You mentioned this sort of looking for traits like being proactive and this sort of thing. How do you sort of define and evaluate those communication skills in like an interview process when you're looking for new engineers who are really gonna harness this sort of culture of communication?
Yes. So I think in the early days when I was listing what to look out for in people during the interview process, I was in the early days very much focused on the behavioral and cultural interview. And one point I listed was communication, and I was like, but there's no real question attached to it, right? It's the whole thing. It's the whole thing throughout, like every um, interview step. You need to prove your communication skills, right? So it really depends on which interview we're talking about, right? And different different steps you showcase communication skills differently. So if we take, for instance, a technical interview, right? You might have you want to look, or we look for people who are proactive, right? And in their communication, who just like by themselves explain what they're doing on every step of the process, who actually are asking questions, who use easy language, who kind of bring these different traits again, right? So like again, like it's attached to like proactiveness, empathy of the person who's sitting with you in the technical interview. But in general as well, like if we take every step of the process, what is the language that they use? The ease of the language, right? And this goes back to the topic of like when you speak to non-technical stakeholders, do they actually explain it in simple terms, or do they throw around very complex keywords that like not everyone on the other side of the table would understand immediately? Do they proactively clarify these things? Do they in between ask like, is there anything that you want to ask, or that I should clarify, right? So empathetic communication, right? So it's evaluated throughout, and you can see the engagement of the person with their own communication skills, right? So I think then one thing that's, when we think about what is the difference between good and great candidates as well, right? I think when people really know how to utilize communication and they pick up things like metaphors and they bring examples of like to explain these details, I think that's when I realize, okay, we have someone here who knows how to use communication and move forward, right? But in the end, it's more like the ease of the flow. Do they also stop talking at some point, right? Do they clarify their point at the beginning? I think that's important more to myself. Like if you have something longer to explain, go on first with like, okay, this is what I like, this TLDR, and now I'm going to explain what this is about, right? Instead of like going for 10 minutes on a monologue and yeah, then losing the person on the other side. So yeah, different things, different themes, but in the end, many things that come together.
I love this idea of like this proactive sort of proactive communication, obviously using easy language, being generally sort of down to earth and simple to understand rather than being sort of ambiguous and things. And I think what goes under the radar is what you just said there, like being conscious of what you're saying, right? Like maybe after you've been speaking for 2 minutes, pause and say, does everyone understand this? And does anyone have any questions? I think that's that's really important. Out of interest, while we're on the topic of interviews, it's always a big one. What's your sort of favorite style of technical assessment? Would it be a technical assessment? Would it be homework? Would it be, like you said, this kind of paired programming and assessing the communication thing?
I think it's we've done pretty much everything from different coding tools to homeworks, and I think the best thing is really more collaborative exercises on the spot, right? I know many people don't like kind of like the whiteboarding exercise, but I think it showcases also as well how people communicate and collaborate with each other, right? So it's not necessarily purely focused on, okay, how do they, what style of code are they using? How are they technically proficient, etc. But like actually, how do they go on about it? How do they clarify? How do they collaborate? Is it easy to give maybe feedback when they've written something wrong? Yes, it's a higher pressure situation because you're put on the spot. But I think if you prepare the candidate and give a heads up, and this is what it's going to be about, and wrap your head around it, maybe not exactly the task, but like to get into the headspace, then it's a lot more beneficial to do a collaborative exercise. You save time of the candidates if you send them home for send a homework to them. Some people might spend like hours and hours on this, right? And some might just like stick to the time necessary, right? So it's very different. And personally, I prefer like the more collaborative style.
Great answer. In terms of sort of communicating to different audiences, whether it be an interview as a software engineer to an executive, or yourself in terms of talking to higher management executives, these like non-technical these stakeholders and decision makers, where miscommunication can really lead to a lot of mistakes. How do you sort of minimize these misinterpretations and ensure this kind of clarity?
I think, this goes back to what I said previously, like clarifying the goals and the intentions, perhaps coming up with guidelines and work agreements. But I think, especially when we speak of, let's say a normal software developer speaking to executives or leadership, this is something that needs to be learned as an IC, right? So I think many get away until the senior level to be not working on their communication, and maybe they are there where they are with a very specific communication style. For instance, many software engineers are opinionated and they say their opinion, or and they are actually doing good with it. So like, oh, they're opinionated, they say their opinions, they're very proficient, but they cannot adapt their communication style, right? So you need to learn, who are you talking to? How do I get the best outcome? Because not always will I be able to just speak unfiltered and get the same outcome, right? So I think as an engineer, it's highly important to understand that, like, okay, how do we get on the same page with what I'm trying to say here? And I'm not going to get on the same page when I tell them about the specific details of why our the performance of our apps is not good because of some sort of request in the background that we cannot get rid of fast enough, right? You want to translate, then again, the business value, right? And like that's what the people are interested in, right? And so you need to learn, how do you break this down in easy language, in common language that the other person understands. And I think this is where, also going back to the beginning, people need to practice seeing their voice as a tool, right? I've been in many presentations where very senior engineers try to get buy-in from stakeholders, but do it very monotonous and like don't really showcase what is the value or what is the point they're trying to bring. So I think this is something you need to work on as you get more senior and into more leadership roles, etc. Because again, communication is influence if you do it right.
Yeah, I love that. Communication is influence, and like you said, varying the volume of your tones, and what you said when we were talking about this effective communication, just it all goes back to the same, simple but so effective and really so hard to implement, because when you're in that environment and you're like, there's a big CEO breathing down your neck or something, like, what's the business impacts? You might crumble, go into technical jargon, you might overstate the value of something, and it's so important, like you said, to get on the same page and create this sort of story, as it were, right? And get that buy-in, and essentially get that influence.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add as well is, like, especially software engineers, especially when we talk about like this straightforwardness or being opinionated and having this one particular style that worked for them, as soon as you try to explain, to vary, and to work on communication in order to influence, oftentimes people see this um, as managementese, sugarcoating, right? Like, oh, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to say things like how they are. And yes, there are also cultural differences playing a role here as well. But I think people need to understand that it's not managementese or like sugarcoating. It's trying to get on the same page with a person and get to the outcome that everyone is happy about, right? And so I think this is why, especially in engineering, people need to be mindful how to progress with their communication skills.
Nice, and it always goes back to this sort of emotional intelligence as well, right? And using your communication, as an influential tool. I really love that, and I think that's a perfect way to end that section. And really some really good positive impacts, and also positive things that people can pick up themselves and maximize that. Going into the final section is always my favorite, and gets a little bit digging into the kind of personal life and sort of your routine and things. Do you have a morning routine that maximizes productivity as a tech leader?
Look, I'm also just a human being, so it's not always perfect. I have my routines once in a while, and I think, like, especially in the morning, it's important for myself to get moving, and like maybe for me to get out cycling, right? To be mindful. I like also starting off the day. I have like a daily document that I fill out, and I think this is such a great tool as well on a personal level and a work level. And basically what it has is like, at the start of the day, like, how do I feel? Give the emotion a name, right? And I do the same thing at the end of the day, like are there any differences, right? And then I bring up the wheel of emotions, right? To actually pinpoint, okay, where do I stand today, right? And I think it's nice to be very mindful about where do you stand and where is this coming from, actually. So when I acknowledge the feeling, like why do I feel this way today? And so like elaborate a bit on that, right? And then at the end of the day, I like to reflect a bit on what happened. So what did you learn today? Is the question. And so you then need to go back throughout the day and like list all the small little moments that you've been through to really acknowledge as well. Okay, I've learned something. Or sometimes you haven't, and then you think like, oh, maybe I should actually do something now, right? And this then goes over into like gratitude, and like I usually list 5 points of what am I grateful for, right? More broader, more on the day basis. So it could be anything really. And I think it's just like a positive practice to really manage your emotions well, right? Again, like I don't, like sometimes I drop off by a couple of weeks until I pick it up again. But I think these are the things that really work for myself. And I think to remain calm and steady and ride the roller coaster of emotions, right?
Yeah, I love that. It's actually a very unique answer. You know, I think you're a big fan of like journaling and sort of gratitude journaling and things like this. But you know, mostly when I ask this question, it's you know, it's very much like what they do in the day routine, this, that, and it's never really taking the time to actually look back and be like, what am I even feeling in the morning? Why am I feeling like this? Like, because you can just go day to day and then 2 years later you can sort of like wake up, you know, you could be like, oh my god, I've missed so much, even though I thought I was on top of everything. Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. I'm absolutely rubbish at journaling. I've probably done 2 entries this year, but when I did the writing, I felt amazing afterwards. And I should get back into it. So thank you very much. What advice would you give to someone just really starting out in the tech industry? I love this sort of question. It appeals to like a lot of our audience, sort of junior software engineers or software engineers in their first role. What advice would you give to someone starting out?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and this goes for, I think, everyone. Be proactive. I think this is one of the traits that I really value most in people. Don't wait for things to come your way. You want to pick things up proactively. There are usually enough problems to work on. Don't wait for someone to tell you what to do. If something needs to get done, even if you don't have the skills, dive right into it, figure it out, right? Be be uncomfortable, right? Especially in the early days, you'll be more uncomfortable than comfortable, and this is a good thing. Being uncomfortable means you're in a place of growth, right? And this goes for people who are going to new roles, let's say leadership roles as well. You will feel uncomfortable, right? You will have imposter syndrome. But one great advice that I've received when I was confronted with my own personal imposter syndrome was, Gab, you've got imposter syndrome? Congratulations. That only means that you're challenging yourself to be better and you want to grow, right? So it's a sign of growth. And so I think be proactive and be uncomfortable.
That's great, and I think it's such a thing in today's society as well, where people underestimate their own value, right, and their own actual effect on things, and it's about putting in that extra percent and really like challenging yourself to be better, like you said. I love the uncomfortableness thing as well. When I did this first podcast, even the first leadership event 2 years ago, I think I'm uncomfortable every single 15 minutes before it happens, and then you get on the call, you just acknowledge that it's you're here and this is what you're doing and this is how you're growing, and yeah, it puts it a much better mindset. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and we were speaking a bit about metaphors today, right? And so there was recently a video that I watched as well, where what someone was explaining, and this goes more into the curve of life. But if you imagine like the heart monitor in the hospitals, where you have the EKG, or I think what it's called, right? So you have the ups and the downs, right? And that's just like a representation of life overall, right? So like if it were stable, nothing, like if it would be flatlining, nothing's happening, right? So you need the ups, you need the downs, right? Constantly being uncomfortable is also like not great, right? You will get to a comfortable space at some point, and then it's important to acknowledge, okay, now it's time to be uncomfortable again. Don't be comfortable for too long, right? So you need the ups and downs.
Yeah, I love that. I always say like no one's comfortable running a marathon, you know, it's always uncomfort. And it's about what you get out of it mentally and physically. Speaking about this new generation, what do you see for the new generation of hires? Any advice that you can bestow your wisdom upon?
I think, I mean, the first thing that I thought about is just like all of this AI stuff, right? So like get ahead of the curve, right? Like I think especially, you know, it's easy to get worried about like, oh, our jobs are in question. Like I think embrace what is coming our way and the new tools that we can leverage to explore new ways and how to produce code or build applications, and to make our lives more efficient, right? Because like I think especially when you're young and like just soaking up all the knowledge like a little baby or a little child, right? um, this is then where you can reap a lot of benefit and expose it to the others around you. So I think that is my thought here.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've had a few things about sort of AI related topics, as in like some leaders said the best advice they can give is don't use those technologies until like you can do the simple things. And then some of the other leaders have said just make sure like you said, you understand and you get ahead of this curve and understand what really works and what doesn't work. In terms of there's some applications where I think like you just click through. I think you just press enter and it will just it'll code for you almost. And it's about being sort of on top of that, understanding why are you doing that.
And I think, yeah, and I think both sides have a fair point, right? And I think most importantly is, you want to provide value in the end of the day, right? And if that is using generated code in the end of the day, like how many people of us like copy pasted code from Stack Overflow? Now we have just like something that does it automatically. So you free up some headspace for other things, right? I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. Maybe you can think as an engineer more of the business value that you're providing, right? So I think it has both it's fair points, right? But I think like, okay, it's coming no matter what. Let's embrace it. Probably our roles as engineers and engineering leaders will shift in the near future. But what an exciting ride as well, right?
Yeah, I had some great advice as well from Phil Bennett from Kilo Health, who was on episode 3 or 2, I believe. He said have something else that you're good at as well outside of software engineering. Like you said, like understand the business context, understand how to sell something. I think that's super important, like you said.
And you can always do well with like improving you know, your so-called soft skills as well. This is something that like machines cannot take away yet, right?
Absolutely. On the theme of technology, documentation, these kind of things, what's your sort of top 3 book recommendations, or top 5, or just your holy Bible?
Yeah, so I think let me think. So I think as an engineering manager, so to say, or someone like starting off, I really like the book Managing Humans from Michael Lopp, because it displays it in a very humorous way. I think one book that really helped me, I think one of the biggest struggles that I needed to wrap my head around is like how to structure teams and so on. So I can highly recommend the book Team Topologies, um, to give an understanding on how companies usually shape their tech organizations. Um, and then I have like a few more like indirect books that are not necessarily leaning to engineering directly. But I think one thing that I personally always highly valued um, was culture. I think th- that is so important. As I said, the first 10 people, especially when you have a startup and you're building towards a common goal. So there's a book about Netflix culture, which is No Rules Rule. That's something I enjoyed. Um, and more broader space, a book called Range. It talks about the uh, differences of generalists versus specialists in the world of today. And that was very interesting to see the different examples of how it applies and how being open to knowledge from other industries can be useful for other problem spaces and industries as well. So these are the books that come to my mind right now.
Amazing. So, managing humans, team topologies, no rules, rule, and range. Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Um, what is your best sort of advice for balancing sort of personal life and work? Do you have a, obviously you talked about the sort of journaling and things like this. Is it quite a similar approach or?
I think don't first of all don't see it as a balance, right? Now this might edge with some people, but like I think with whatever you do it 100% or 120%, right? And I think um, you should at work do your absolute best and what you need to achieve. But if you on a personal level have things that are like highly important to you, then you have to carve out the space as well and be 100%, right? Otherwise, you're not being true to yourself as well, right? But seeing it as a balance and a balance act and like, how do I do this? Because in the end of the day, work is like how much? 80% of our lives or day itself, right? And we don't have actually much time, and so we better see it as like making it worthwhile and enjoying the things that we do, right? So ideally this is just part of your life and something that you enjoy. And I know that this doesn't count for everyone, but I think it's highly important to in no matter what you do it 100%. Balancing always strikes, implies that there's something off either way, right? So
Yeah, that's a really good point. You've killed my question there. Yeah, I like that sort of like how to make the job worthwhile, right? Because a lot of people, you know, need to learn how to really become passionate about what they're doing and picking that up.
and I think these days a lot of people are also just stuck with golden handcuffs. So they think that they are, oh, I'm getting a good compensation, I'm going to be safe here, instead of actually pursuing what they really want to do, right? And I think that is the important bit to figure out for yourself. It's not about work-life balance. It's like, how do you want to spend your life in general, right? Or the time that has been given to you.
mm, um, on a lighter note, what's your favorite Berlin drink of choice? Alcohol or soft?
Well, is it Berlin specific? I don't know. If it's Berlin specific, then the first thing that came to my mind was Berliner Luft. Yeah, it's like a shot. Overall, I would always like tend, I'm a big gin collector, so I'll fall back to any form of gin. Like I actually There's a really good gin from Berlin as well, but I cannot remember the name right now. But those are my choices for now.
Nice. And what about favorite food? Doesn't have to be essentially Berlin, but any recommendations?
I think, I'll recommend a place here in Berlin, actually. So one of my favorite places is Yafo, or Yafo, and it's an Israeli place. So they make amazing hummus, and can recommend anyone going there.
Nice. And what is your favorite country to visit and why?
Well, I gotta say Spain here, just because it's been on top of my mind, and I've been there quite often over the last couple of years, because I just love the outdoorsy culture, the mountain ranges. I've been a lot to Mallorca in particular to cycle. That's my passion. So I really enjoy that kind of lifestyle, and the eating culture, the togetherness, and just being very outdoorsy, right? Berlin can be quite dark and grim during the winters, so it's nice for a change to, seek Spain out for help.
What bike do you have at the moment? Like a racing bike or?
Yeah, I have a road bike. It's a Cannondale Super 6 Evo Ultegra disc from 2020 for the passionate cyclists out there.
Yeah. I think there's probably a lot of them in Berlin. Myself, I just know I have a road bike and it goes fast, and that's what I know.
Yeah, exactly.
And then lastly, mate, any feedback on this podcast?
Well, on this particular one from today?
Yeah.
No, I think it was great. I think we picked a great topic to bring attention to, right? Because it's something that we so much underestimate. It's, how much do we communicate during the day, right? And we don't think about it, sitting on the couch, WhatsApping our friends, right? Writing an email, talking to our parents, talking to our colleagues. Most of our days we spend communicating, right? Maybe if you're lucky enough as an IC engineer, you might get away with some 4-hour focus time, but in general, you spend a lot of the time communicating. And so it's important to be mindful how to use this. And again, use your voice as a tool. And I think many people of us think this is just the way I speak. That's not true. You just need to practice being uncomfortable, right? So when you have a monotonous tone, usually, then practice going high in the pitch and talking this way, or going lower in the pitch, right? You need to practice a bit and practice being, again, uncomfortable. So I love the podcast and how we conversed, and hopefully you get to more of these kind of topics in the future, and I can also personally have more of these kind of things as well.
Yeah, I love it, and I love the podcasts that I do around the topics of really social leadership, right? And this is what it's all about. And if there's one thing I'll take away from this, it's definitely communication is influence, right? And we'll go from there. And thank you so much for taking some time and really breaking down some of these techniques on effective communication, some of the communication strategies, and how you would deal with everyone in terms of business context and in your personal life as well. So I really appreciate your time today, mate. We're all on a journey of communication, and we're all getting better at it, right? So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Gab.
Thank you for your time as well, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us today on our 5th episode of the podcast Source Talks, the Tech Lab. I'd love to thank Gab for joining me. It's been absolutely great being part of this discussion. I hope you enjoyed listening. You can listen on all major streaming platforms. You can find us on our website. We can also on LinkedIn at Source Technology. If you're interested in joining our community, do reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We can book in a call and join our growing community of engineering leaders. can't wait to share more conversations like this as always, so you can take yourself to the next level. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good evening.